it's all pre-taped.
Welcome to the second season of Live from Diane's Living Room. We're delighted to welcome you back to our not live, but local program. And today we're joined by Pastor Ashley Goff of Arlington Presbyterian Church, which is located at Gilliam Place on Columbia Pike, a beehive of community engagement and activism and all around goodwill. And welcome to the program, Ashley.
Thanks for having me, Diane.
It's a thrill. So a little bit of background. Ashley cold emailed me maybe 3 or 4 years ago saying, "Hi, I'm new to Arlington. We might have things to talk about. How about if I make an appointment to come over and talk with you?" And I can say in my 40 plus years of being a librarian, a person of faith has never reached out to me to say, "Hey, we might have things in common."
That's disappointing.
It is disappointing, but it just shows you how cool and hip and groundbreaking and envelope stretching you are. So that's awesome. So,
Thank you, Diane.
so we had a great conversation in my office, and we talked about kind of what we're doing and what your plans for. I don't think Gilliam Place was opened at the time.
No, it was under construction.
Okay. Under construction. So you sought me out, but what brought you to Arlington to begin with?
So I've been here with my spouse since 1998, and Bob Glennon is my spouse, and he grew up in Alexandria.
Okay.
And we were both in New York. I was in New York City for seminary. Bob was at Columbia University for social work. And we graduated at the same time and knew we wanted to be around family. And I grew up in Ohio, and that was not the obvious place where I wanted to be. And so Bob's family was still in this area. So we decided to move down here. And our first apartment was on Wayne Street, right off of Columbia Pike, where Bob and Edith's is. And we got that because a friend of a friend was moving out, and the rent was, it was like $500 or something. Yeah. Really ridiculous. So we took it this apartment sight unseen. That was in 1998, and we've had, we've been in South Arlington ever since. So.
Okay. And do you have children?
Yes.
Okay.
Sam is a first year at JMU, so he actually just went back to James Madison last week. He was home virtually for the first semester. And Maddie is in 11th grade. She's at Wakefield High School, and Ryan is in 8th grade, and he's at Gunston.
Okay, so your husband Bob grew up in the area in Alexandria. What were your impressions of Arlington when you first decided to go ahead and live here?
Well, I had lived in, we lived in New York City for 3 years. And the year before that, Bob and I met in Atlanta. We lived in Southwest Atlanta, and I can say more about that later, what we were doing there. So I had these urban experiences. I had been abroad when I was in London. When I was in college, I was in London. So I'd had these urban experiences, and I was really kind of determined. I grew up in a very bougie suburb of Ohio. So I was like, ditching the suburbs. We got to go urban. And when Bob and I were looking for a place to live, moving down here, he said, I'm like, well, we're going to live in DC, not living in the suburbs. Because my experience of suburbs were white flight. So Bob said, well, I don't know, we should really look at Arlington. He was pretty also committed to being, in this kind of Northern Virginia area. So we found this great apartment, and Arlington was more representational and diverse back then than it is now. I mean, Clarendon was like all, used car dealerships and Vietnamese restaurants. That was the Vietnamese community. So there were these, after being in New York, where these pockets of ethnic communities. This certainly wasn't New York City or Queens by any means, but it still had these pockets of where communities were living. So that was really kind of a surprise to me, because I'd been in the suburbs, grew up in the suburbs where it was really homogeneous. So I was taken by the representation, the diversity, particularly of South Arlington, and that 22204 zip code. And what it kind of had this urbanish feel that was very much welcome after living in New York City. So.
Sure. And I grew up here in
Mm.
Arlington, actually, and I can remember the Clarendon being, I don't know, Little Saigon, and
Yeah.
all of the specialty stores and the restaurants like Queen Bee, et
Yep.
cetera, and they're all gone.
I know.
And then El Salvadorans and Central American people came in, and they're not as abundant in number as they used to be. And I do worry about that, because what is it about this community? Yes, it's very expensive, but are we not welcoming? And one of the things that attracted me to you and the work you're doing with Gilliam Place, it just seems like it's not only diverse, but a very welcoming and accepting community.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did that match happen with you and Arlington Presbyterian?
Yeah. So I've been at a church in another Presbyterian church in DuPont Circle for 15 years. And, I was realizing it was time for me to go for multiple reasons. And the way that the Presbyterian system works, it works on a call system. So a congregation calls you. The Methodists are appointed, right? So the bishop kind of appoints their clergy throughout. So but Arlington also was going a little bit of a different route, where they needed what was called a designated pastor. They needed someone in right away. The call process is a pretty grueling process, and it can take 18 months to 2 years for a congregation and a clergy person to make a final, yes to each other. So, but because of the build out of APC's own space in Gilliam Place, and the timeline of that, and where APC was in its own kind of journey and process to Gilliam Place, they needed someone in pretty quickly. So the presbytery, our local kind of governing judicatory body, they use this process called a designated pastor, which is a little bit of a call process and a little bit of a matchmaking. So my name, I wanted, I started kind of spying on Arlington maybe in the fall. I forget what year it was. I've been here 2.5 years. And so basically the Presbytery and Arlington Presbyterian and I kind of, did this little dance for a little bit. And I put the equivalent of a clergy resume into the system around April of that year. And I was here in July. So it was thankfully a very quick process. So now I'm living and working in Arlington County, which is a delight.
Yeah. So the process, I'm familiar with the call process. I went through it. I was raised Catholic. I moved on from that. I spent a brief amount of time in the Episcopal community, and that's where I went through a call process. But I have friends who are very active in the Lutheran community, and they've had interims, and so I'm familiar with that. But I just, in terms of your energy and enthusiasm and outward facing, outreach centric worldview, if you will, how difficult of a match was that to the community? Because and let me explain. I grew up in Arlington, but I lived for a long time in DC and worked in a different library. And every community has its own culture. So even though I've been a librarian since, '10, you come into a new culture, you've got different ideas, and how there's a little dance that you have to do to make sure your values and your directions and visions, if you will, align. So what was that process like for you?
Yeah. So the church I was in DC was, it had its own kind of particular uniqueness, very progressive, Black Lives Matter banner, and had been, in Bede and DuPont was a welcoming congregation to LGBTQ plus people. So I wasn't just gonna go anywhere. I'm not that universal. And so I was pretty particular about what I wanted to do next. I also knew that I wasn't going to uproot my family and go anywhere. I wasn't going to go to Idaho for a call. Like those days are over. So what attracted me was APC's story, right? So in 2016, after a lengthy discernment process, they felt called by God to do something really radical around the affordable housing crisis in Arlington County. So in 2016, they sold their land, their property, their building to Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing.
Uh-huh.
And then in, what was it, 2018, they broke ground. So Gilliam Place started to build out Gilliam Place. So the church building was demolished, and the rubble taken away, and Gilliam Place, went from there. So when I say this, Diane, when a congregation, when any place, but when a congregation blows up a building, they blow up a lot. And they're saying a lot about who they are and what they're tied to, and their trajectory forward. So you blow up a lot of this crap that we are in a 2,000-year-old institution, and spoiler, there's a whole lot of baggage. And so they had to make a pretty clear choice about how they wanted to exist in this ancient tradition. And so when you just blow up, dysfunctional power systems, you blow up just systems that just aren't working anymore, and you just open your door, you open your sense to this real sense of possibility and freedom, and a lot of unknown and uncertainty, which is pretty unnerving. But they really, they just walked right into that for the sake of their neighbors. And that type of fearlessness was very appealing to me. I did not want to work in a place that was really stuck behind its walls, that had systems that were archaic, that people would just wanted to go back to the 1950s, right, as we hear, which is, probably one of the more horrifying times to actually envision yourself going back to, including the church. And so I wanted to be part of a place that did something like this. And honestly, I was pretty tired of a building. I was tired of waiting for the next flood, in a church building. That is not a vision. That is not a way to exist. It's just to wait for the next wreckage of a building. So I really wanted to jettison. I mean, we're in a building, but it's so different. I didn't want to be part of that anymore. And I had some real clarity around that. So I like the small. I mean, we have about 50 people here at APC, a whole bunch left when they did this move to Gilliam Place. And so I am drawn to the small for the intimacy, the sense of community, and what you can build with small, and not to build to be bigger with more people, but just to create, community and belonging and ways of being leaders that don't just follow a certain type of path. So.
Yeah. No, that is a remarkable story. I didn't know much of it at all, except for the basic superficial facts of, first there was a church and then there's community housing.
Yeah.
But
no, I mean, one of their great lines, I mean, I say this all the time, Diane, in a public testimony, John Atherton, one of the members, said the call from God to do something about affordable housing was bigger than the building itself. So the building had to go. And I'm like, who says that?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, you said they were fearless, but just think about too, the selflessness, the recognition that it's not all about me and my privilege, whatever that might be and whatever that might look like, but there are people in greater need than I, and I'm called to do something about that. That's remarkable. I don't know of many organizations. I've often dreamed of blowing up something and starting over again. Alas, I have not had that chance. I live vicariously through people and institutions like you, but I think that's a remarkable story. I don't know how well known it is in the community, but that's one of the reasons why we do these conversations, is because we want to learn more about who we are and who our neighbors are and what it takes to make this community not only grow but thrive. And certainly that's a wonderful example.
I mean, they were willing to accept the death of their own congregation for the sake of their neighbors. And I had gone through a pretty, my colleague of 15 years had recently died from pancreatic cancer. And so I was kind of coming out of my own kind of really intense grief journey. And so to see a congregation to embrace, to really get curious about their own death and what that would mean, and that they were willing to die, at some point along the way, the church has kind of gotten this idea that it can exist until the end time. It's actually entitled to exist. And I don't believe that. And so they actually, they're like, they didn't want to close, but they were willing to, and say that, well, we left 173 affordable housing units on the pike, and that's enough. And they were willing to kind of walk away. And that was probably that sense of freedom that comes from that type of interrogating, your own kind of existential existence was really appealing to me.
Well, it's not only appealing, it's also an incredible model for the rest of us that this group was willing to walk away from legacy
Yeah.
and permanence
Yeah.
and step off into unknown. And
Mhm.
not many of us are willing to do that.
Yeah.
So we've been in a pandemic. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've been in a pandemic. And so how's it been to be a pastor
Mhm.
in these times when we're used to going to church on Sunday, choir, yeah, blah 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 blah, readings, hold hands, but you're doing that, I assume, still
Yes.
remotely? Okay,
Yes. Yes. No, churches are super spreaders. We should not be meeting
right.
until it is safe. Um, so no, we shut, March 15th, we shut down. It was that kind of 1 week where everything just seemed to kind of like hit the fan.
Yes.
And, like most people were like, well, we'll be here a month, maybe July. And, if there was any congregation that knew how to pivot for this, and we're closed for the sake of our neighbors, right? Like, so we
Sure.
aren't a super spreader. We're closed for ourselves because that, you love yourself as you love your neighbors. So we're closed for our own safety and for the safety of of our neighbors. And if there's any congregation that's willing to pivot for that, it's Arlington Presbyterian. But nonetheless, I mean, all of us, huge brain shift in just how do you do what we do.
Right.
So thankfully, I have a really great colleague, Abby Madden. She's our minister of music, and she's
Mhm.
pretty savvy on the technology. So we kind of whipped ourselves up virtually pretty quickly. Um, and and I mean, I don't even want to look at the first virtual service we did, Diane. It's like, God. But we have, we've just kind of taken it. And obviously, since we know we're going to in here for a bit of time still, we just, one thing that's really important to us is participation and engagement in the moment in liturgy, in worship on Sunday mornings. And so we've just figured out how to do that too. And that's, it's been a challenge, but it's been fun that's kind of fun for me, to figure those things out. And I mean, and we just kept at it. I mean, we were pretty clear we didn't want to come out of this with regret,
Mhm.
about how we showed up with our neighbors. So, I've shared with you before that we realized around April or May, we were in continuing conversations with APA, about how to support our neighbors. And, in Gilliam Place, there's about 500 people here in the building, most, intergenerational building, mostly Black, Indigenous, people of color. And people are getting hungry, right? I mean, that was instantaneous. I mean, the rental eviction was a fear and
Sure.
hunger because of job loss and hourly wages loss. So we, a longer story short, we partnered up with APA and CPRO, Columbia Pike Revitalization Organization, and we did fresh produce distribution, farmers market produce distribution every Sunday morning for the entire summer. So the church paid for the produce to get out. So every Sunday, someone could, you could come down out of your apartment, masks, the whole deal, and you could get a box of fresh produce
Mhm.
for free. And then we set up these tables that had like household cleaners and masks, and those were also free. So it was a way of being engaged with our neighbors in a way that was safe, but also provided them with some pretty essential things. And that was a really, and I love when spaces get transformed. So a utilitarian garage got transformed into a place where we make community.
Right.
And that was pretty great. And it was very organic, and it, just like the food. But we just, I'm a big fan and a student of improv, and I've taken improv classes, and they probably have served me. That's been the best thing for my work.
Sure.
Is that you act in order to discover what's next. You don't just sit there and wait for something to come. So it's a lot of listening and observing and noticing, but we had to act in order to actually figure out what to do.
Well, that was actually one of the maybe the next time that you reached out to me. I got an email from you, I don't know, April, May. You maybe knew that I was involved
Yeah, the
in
coalition.
food issues for the county and making sure that people in need did not go without. And again, you reached out to me. This is annoying me. What can we
I'm
do?
pissed. I was pissed. I'm like,
You were
people
pissed.
People are
Yes,
paying.
and I was like, oh my God, this is great. And Megan's our producer who's with us today, and our colleague Alex Geller, who was kind of my right-hand person, and you know Alex, and we said, great, another willing partner, and you would send me periodic updates about the Sunday, the food fair, and somebody's selling masks, and somebody's doing something else, and it seemed like it was this community event, safe, socially distant.
Yeah, one Sunday, like the NAACP was out there at the end of the summer for numerous weeks doing voter registration. Then we had NAACP, then we had Phoenix Bikes. They were out there fixing bikes like in the spring, early in the summer. No, it was late in the summer. Anyway, like at once, and then there was us and the food. So one Sunday, literally it's like bring your bike, get registered to vote, get some food, and get a nice mask, and some toilet paper. So, it was really, it was this whole community thing happening. So
it is a community thing. And what I also appreciate about it is it's a church, but it feels, it doesn't feel structured. And, again, I grew up in a very structured religious environment, and can't imagine back then this kind of outpouring. And you just did it, you just went, you saw the need, and it makes, in many ways, I think it makes God and religion and spirituality accessible to people who might be a little hesitant, a little bit more on the fence, so that's not really me, but they can see the benefit of when we reach out to others and say we care. And I think that's just it's not only you, Ashley, my friend, pastor, but also what you're embodying for that community. And I think it's just so special and so empowering.
Yeah. And that's the gift of being in this place where that Arlington Presbyterian did, is that we're in real proximity. And so the hope is that we are in community with our neighbors in Gilliam Place. And what does that look like? In kind of the non-patronizing, creepy missionaries type stuff, that the church was embedded in for so long, that there was a real relationship of dominance. And so, the language we use now is this whole idea of an ecosystem, right? That if one of us is hurting, the rest of us are hurting, or if one of us is rejoicing, the rest of us are rejoicing. And so with La Cocina, now they're kind of right behind me, and the neighbors and APA and us, like that's our work, is to create this ecosystem to show that you can create a kind of alternative community in a way, and shape relationships differently than what the ways of dominance tell us to be, which the way, white supremacy, dominance, they don't like the idea of being a neighbor. They don't like neighborliness. So
well, and also systems of patriarchy. As I said, I grew up in a system where it was white males, and very aloof and distant, and Vatican II did a lot to change some of that. But it very definitely was, we're here, you're there. And
and the priest was the expert, right? The priest was the one with all the wisdom, all the knowledge, and the rest of us were there to, it's a very I have a lot of reverence for the Catholic Church in a lot of ways, but that type of model across the board, right? They call it banking education, right? So the priest is there to deposit the information into the poor people who know less. And that just is instantaneous hierarchy.
Well, I'm sure it's changed, because again, I'm banking on a memory that's now many, many, many years old, but it's definitely refreshing to hear from you and others like you about different ways to be showing up in the community. Now, I do, my wife's uncle is very active in the Methodist, was raised Methodist, and the Methodists are going through some sort of process around LGBTQ plus issues, etc. Is that anything that's also that topic affecting the Presbyterian Church? Are the Methodists sort of on their own thing with this schism, if you will?
The Presbyterians are a different place, and I would say all the mainline denominations have gone through what the Methodists have gone through, are going through right now. So Yeah, one of the commitments I made, one of my, in my mid-20s, this is how I'm gonna live the rest of my life, manifesto, it was never live in the suburbs, never drive a minivan, and never work in a church that doesn't have a rainbow flag. So I live in the suburbs, have a really great minivan. I've always maintained my commitment to the rainbow, to a church with a rainbow flag. There are those who, it wasn't too long ago that as a woman, I would not have been able to be ordained.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so why would I want to be part of a denomination that wouldn't ordain queer
Right.
people? So I'm actually ordained in the United Church of Christ, which has been ordaining people who have been out since the late 70s. The UCC has a local autonomy governance, so the local church makes its decisions. So that's that allowed that type of work to take hold quickly. The Presbyterians have a different polity, and so there's a little more kind of higher, there's no bishop, but there's a little bit more structure, so to speak.
Right.
So yes, it's only been within, the past several years where LGBT people plus people who are out can be ordained. And that for a while, if you officiated a wedding ceremony, 2 men, 2 women, you could have been stripped of your ordination vows.
Yes.
And
not too long ago, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I've worked in, both Arlington Presbyterian, the previous church I worked in are more like Presbyterian churches, which means that we've made this particular identity to be more light, which means we work for the full participation of LGBTQ plus people in church and society. So in previous, when there were these restrictions on marriage and ordination, if you ordained an elder, a lay person who was out, if you officiated a wedding, you would, one, you'd be practicing what's called ecclesiastical disobedience, but your governing body could be removed, and a clergy person could be stripped of their ordination.
Right.
So that is now changed, and you can be out. There's marriage equality in the Presbyterian Church, and interesting enough, at the General Assembly, the every 2-year national gathering that followed after after marriage equality passed and inclusive ordination passed, literally, Diane, the next one, they take up like a $40,000 offering, and they're in Louisville, I believe. They march it down to the local jail and they pay off people's bonds, right? Yeah. So turns out when you stop this fighting, you can actually do the work. That what we see is Jesus calls us to do, right? You liberate the captives.
Exactly.
Instead of this toxic horribleness that, this homophobia was just, lots of churches left the denomination. It was like, okay, peace out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's probably still true. Living in Arlington, I can usually tell which congregations are more accepting than others. But you mentioned the word toxicity a second ago. I want to pick up a little bit on that. So we're in a pandemic, and we've just emerged from 4 years of rampant toxicity. And so you're a person of faith, and you are a leader in a faith community. How do you provide pastoral care when so much around us is, falling apart? Institutions are failing us. People are divisive now more than ever. White supremacy is on the rise. What does somebody at your level and your reach, if you will, how do you provide pastoral care for your people?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I will never apologize for being in a congregation that it has a rainbow flag, that, after Biden wins, or, we certainly didn't celebrate that in worship, but there was great relief among the congregation.
Right.
And I didn't have people in our congregation that were like, what about me? I voted for Trump. Right. And I'm not gonna, I'm very proud of being in a congregation where there's that type of welcome, where there's that type of safety. There are other churches, that aren't, and you can go other places where you can, maybe feel more comfortable if you performed with the previous administration. So, so I lift that up, I affirm that, in who we are. And I think the thing that's informed my ministry the past 4 years really is being trauma informed, right? We were in collective trauma. And how does the liturgy, how do we run meetings? How are we together in ways that tend to the trauma that we're feeling as individuals and experiencing individuals and collectively? And then how do you do the healing, the trauma healing work?
Right.
So that's something I take very seriously. And the pandemic is now part of that. This is trauma. And how, I don't say like, what are we doing for the whole year? It's like, what are we doing for the next 3 months?
Yeah.
We keep it short, we keep it small, we keep it to scale, so so some of my work has taken on, learning more about trauma and having certain structures in place for predictability when it feels like there's none, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, with settings, we have our own rituals in the church that we lean on, and the sacraments that provide, kind of its own level of disruption, but also its own their own elements of healing. So, but I don't think it's really going to be clear about how much that impacted us the past 4 years. And, we're just going to continue to find out kind of more horrific things, I think. But also, I have to learn I got a Christian nationalism, right? This is what we saw on January 6th, and how something that is so dear and important to me and to this congregation and to others gets used as a weapon.
Yes.
And Christian nationalism is something we should, something I'm reading more about. I mean, we all should, in the sense of kind of what we're up against.
Right.
Because when you put that fervor in that comes from that religious identity, it is a very powerful beast. So,
well, and I think we were all clearly in an abusive relationship, if you will, regardless of how close we were to the center of the chaos. But I think it will take a long time. I don't think we've begun at all to deal with what the aftermath is. If you pay attention to some of the conversations that are going on across the river, even as we speak, in the Congress, for example. But I think that the trauma is real, and how we manage it and how we get past it and how we recognize that each of us is going to come to it at our own pace, if you will. And it's not, oh, well, that's gone, so let's all pull it together. It's going to take a long time. And one thing that struck me too is that January 6th, if nothing else, was a good reminder that we can never take for granted what we have. We can never take for granted that our institutions are inviolable, that we have to be vigilant, and we can't just say, oh, I just have to turn this. No, you can't turn it out. You have to keep pushing, because look what can happen if you take your eye off the wheel, your hands off the wheel for even a second. And that to me was the scariest part, how quickly it could have been a much, much worse situation than it was. And I'm hoping that there are enough other people who are aware of that, not to be like scary, but to say, hey, look, we have to pay attention.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think the religious dimensions of it is really important for anyone to pay attention to, because, there's language, there's symbols, there's this identity, there's you're talking about esoteric knowledge where people like really think they have a secret understanding of what's happening. Like that is some deep stuff. And that is a worldview. It's not just like an opinion or a thought. That is a way of looking at the world.
Right.
And that, that I just feel like that has to be taken really seriously. It's like, we need a bigger boat of knowledge, and understanding of this. And I'm not saying understanding like we have to agree with it by any means. No, denounce it. But the power of it, we have to really understand.
Yeah, I think that's key. I mean, the understanding, I think people were, I don't know, maybe in a state of denial. Oh, this really isn't happening. Oh, this won't be that serious. Oh, this is really, well, no, that's just, cynicism, and it's just another form of denial. And I think people opted out. But I was curious too, you've reached out to me a couple of times, and as I said, you were the only person of faith who's ever done that. But on a more serious note, are there ways for faith communities and libraries who are also caregivers in the community. You know, it's a different type of caregiving. How can we work together to make sure that the community not only grows, as I said earlier, but thrives?
Yeah. Well, I remember when I talked to you, Diane, you used the word, transactional and relational. You want the libraries to be less transactional and more relational, so that when you come into when you walk into an Arlington Public Library, you have an experience of transformation, and you walk out and you take that back out in order to kind of, embody that transformation, like in your neighborhood and with your neighbors.
Right.
And, and that's my vision for the church, right? So, when you said that, I was like, So that's, the work of how do you create communities, right? That there's this expectation that something is going to happen to you here that actually, that is going to ask something of you to give of your neighbor, to be with your neighbor, to be of your neighbor. So, I mean, that relational component, I think, is just really key, right? So when we see things like, and it's hard with COVID of getting feedback from people and information, but like the recent surveys on kind of how people see race and equity in the county, and it's a survey, right? And like that's a way. But I think capturing stories of people. I mean, I was in the building in Gilliam Place yesterday. I was hanging around outside yesterday, and I ended up talking to I talked to a lot of people, and I'm like, hey, how's it going? What's going on? What are your needs? That type of collaborative work of finding out kind of what's going on with people and what's the pulse of the community and who are the mayors of the community. That's who I'm always looking for. And what does that mean for us as a church? What does that mean for you as a library system? And how you show up as a neighbor to your neighbors. So I think that we're kind of before the pandemic, we spent time, us and some other church folks, we would walk up and down Columbia Pike and talk to the business owners, around Columbia Pike, like, how's it going? Things are changing. How are you experiencing that change? People's rents are like astronomical. It's ridiculous. People are worried about their future and their retirement as a local business, all the things that you would predict. But you start to get what the worry is and what the concerns are, and then how do you meet those people in those places, so, and also places of their joy and what they hope and dream for. So like that's what I would, like next time when we're out of this hellscape, Diane, like we'll walk Columbia Pike together, right? And like you're the librarian and I'm the pastor, and we're gonna like see what's going on with people.
We can be the odd couple of Arlington. I mean, I'm with you. You said something earlier in the conversation about you like small. I do too. If I had my druthers, I would have many small libraries or places where people can meet, come together, share a conversation, talk to one another about books or problems or issues that are facing them. And have those pockets, those spaces really reflect the environment that they're set up in. And as much as I love the way the branch system developed in Arlington, and I have an appreciation for that history and strong legacy, there's so much more we could be doing if we could also go small. So maybe when we're past the current state, and we can be in public together again, in addition to the walks that we're going to take together, we could maybe talk about setting up a little outpost in Gilliam Place. Sponsored by Arlington Public Library for a program or a maker event or a how-to, or this is how you build your, home garden. Because we've got expertise that we can clearly share, but I think in that smaller, more personalized, more particularized environment, we have the opportunity to do more transformation.
I mean,
that away.
And so, I mean, even there are 8 apartments in Gilliam Place that are dedicated, committed to adults with emotional and developmental disabilities. So, so there are 8 mostly young adults who are in those apartments living somewhat independently. Most of them have a roommate, but they've come through a nonprofit called Our Stomping Ground, which is a local Arlington nonprofit. But in the before time, they would, they had Harry Potter readings in our garden, right? So
Oh, awesome.
someone would read Harry Potter and everyone, everyone's sitting in our Adirondack chairs and listening. Like, that's the library, right?
Yes.
Like we're doing library things. And how does the library not only create new moments, but how do you actually affirm, like, that these library moments are happening, and what support can the library provide for those, if any, if needed, but also just for us to claim those as like, this is the library. The library is actually happening here.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's the kind of things I love, is when those things are happening, and then you can kind of interpret them and reinterpret them and edit them through your own language. So
Yes, I mean, the more we can scale these opportunities for building relationships, building connections among and between people, I'm all for it. And one thing that I have missed throughout this long period of being mostly closed is doing what you just did yesterday at Gilliam Place. How you doing? You walk up to the mom or the child or the adult or whatever. And we just don't have that kind of opportunity at the moment, at least not easily.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward, because we've all been through trauma together on many, many levels. What can we learn? How does it help us be better and be more of ourselves in the world? And how does it help us, as you've said so beautifully a number of times, show up better to our neighbors? I mean, because we're all in this together.
Yeah.
We're all coming from a different background or a different place or a different level of education or what have you. But it's only going to work if we're all coming together.
Yeah.
So I think there are many in the after time. I guess we'll be called, the before times, and then it'll be the after
times. Yes.
So where's we need a dystopian author to write an Arlington story or help us, because I'm thinking of books like Lois Lowry's The Giver and some other kinds of things that we can call to mind. But this has been a delightful conversation. I love, you challenge me, and I love that synergy and that electricity that we can get going in our conversations. And I do look forward to the after time when we can actually do some of these things that maybe we're only dreaming and scheming about at the moment.
No, that's okay. I mean, something to keep me to look for, we gotta look forward to something, and it's certainly not the beach. So
no, probably not.
So I gotta have something on my mind to keep the trajectory going forward. So I'm really proud that you're our librarian. I'm really proud of those rainbow flags, and those statements of welcome. I'm, proud of the way that you try to pivot the neighbor, to make connections, break the isolation of older adults, help people enter into the community with a greater sense of belonging. So I'm really proud of that our library sees itself that way. So
we're delighted to be seen. I mean, we work hard to do that, and we recognize always that we can do more, and we want to do more. And but partnerships like yours really spur us on. So there's great things that we can do together. So with that, we will say goodbye for now.
Yep.
All right. Thanks very much.
All right. I appreciate it, Diane.
Thank you. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.